Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. This week I have Jonah Paquette. He is a clinical psychologist, clinical trainer, and author. He's written 3 books: Real Happiness, The Happiness Toolbox, and his most recent book, which was released this year, entitled Awestruck. Jonah is a good friend, and we had a wonderful conversation about a variety of things. In this episode, we talked about the emotion of awe, what it is, how it's defined. We talked about the positive and negative aspects of awe. We talked about the taxonomy of awe and subsequent emotions. We talked about moving the emotion of awe from a state to a trait. We also talked about the current state of positive psychology. And we also talked about the role of political involvement for psychologists and clinicians overall, along with many other topics. This was a fantastic conversation. The 2 hours really flew by, and I can't wait to have him on the podcast again. And I hope you enjoy this episode. And so now I bring you Jonah Paquette. I am here with Jonah Paquette. Jonah, what's going on, man?
Great to connect. Great to well, I'll see you, but no one listening can know that.
Right. Yeah, no, it's great to connect. I've wanted when I started doing this, you were one of the first people I wanted to get on here. So you just have such a nice demeanor and you're, super bright and have so many wonderful ideas. So
Well, it's
yeah,
really kind of you
I
to say. And
yeah.
and considering who you've already had on, it's that puts me in a high echelon. So I appreciate that.
um so I'll just tell listeners just maybe for a little background. So Jonah and I met at a training virtually. He was doing his thing and educating all of us clinicians, and we just kind of connected and kept in touch. And so he's got a lot of wonderful things to say. So I don't know if I told you this. Maybe I did. You can tell me if I'm um, misremembering this, but I've had a kind of I mean, you fit within the world of positive psychology, yeah?
Hmm.
You're
Yeah,
comfortable with that
I'm comfortable. Even though I know you and I both share some misgivings about the whole positive versus negative, which we can of course get to, but yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's a fair umbrella.
Yeah, so I've had I kind of was super kind of agnostic about that whole subset of psychology for a long time, and kind of came into it kicking and screaming, and I really see a lot of the value for it now. And most people associate psychology and specifically clinical psychology with psychopathology, all of the things that are terrible about a person, and not so much more of the more positive qualities and more of the creative aspects, which I think is both are necessary. So I think you have a lot to offer. So okay, you have written 3 books, is that right? 3?
Yes, three books.
And the newest one is Awestruck. I actually have it right here.
Ah, you got it. Amazing.
It's it came out in the
Uh,
summer, right?
yeah, an interesting time to have a book come out right
Uh,
in the middle of the
I was going to
pandemic
ask you
with a
about
lot of
that.
other things going on in the world. But
Yeah, before that, I mean, I don't know if it's like a contractual thing or whatever, but when you were with the publisher and stuff, were you going to do like speaking events and maybe a book tour, or how before COVID, what were
yeah,
your plans for it?
it definitely has disrupted. I'll be honest, I'm not at the sort of Malcolm Gladwell or fill in the blank level of people who they
Sure.
sent out just on a book tour to all around the 50 states. But
Uh-huh.
we had some events planned for sure,
Hmm.
and a lot of this just as it has been for everyone in the world gets thrown into upheaval, and it really has changed how we went about with the launch and how we're looking at it much more longitudinally, for lack of a
Hmm.
better word, right now. And
Hmm.
and my suspicion is that as the world begins to open up, and we start to have a chance to rediscover so much of what we've been missing, that the timing will still be good even if the book had come out a while ago. But yeah, definitely disruptions, but in the grand scheme of things, as we've talked about, still very fortunate many people have had it a lot worse.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get into it, but just as a general idea, how has it been received, even though it's somewhat
Mhm.
unusual this year, but how has it been received just positively, or how's it been received overall?
At least to my face, positively, it seems. Um, yeah, it's a topic that I would say when I talk to clinicians and I do my 3 hour training, 6 hour trainings on it, it's an interesting topic because it's not something that right off the bat people think of as something that you can, we all are familiar with the experience of awe and having those moments of wonder, but I think it's still in a strange way takes people by surprise when they recognize just how seminal it has been in their own lives and just
Mhm.
how many of those peak moments that come to mind for them are inherent in that. So
Yeah.
I would say that if anything, it resonates more with people as you get them talking and thinking about it,
Mhm.
versus right off the bat. If you might just say, "Oh yeah, I wrote a book on awe," people are like, "Oh, that's nice,"
Yeah.
but then you get talking and it goes a little bit further.
Yeah, certainly. And I reread it last week. It was really good. So before we get into it, just tell listeners a little bit about yourself, kind of your snapshot of who
Mhm.
you are, why this is an interest, what are some of your other interests, and a little bit what you do, and um, kind of current ideas you're chewing on and going forward in the future.
Sure. I'll start kind of from the beginning, but very briefly. Born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, actually,
Mhm.
and most of my family's back there. Stayed in New York through college, which was when I started to dabble more into psychology and begin to start to think about moving into this field and becoming a psychologist. And really, could have ended up anywhere, applied all over the country for grad schools, and happened to end up in the Bay Area, which I thought would be a 4 or 5 year stop before going back to New York. And as I tell people out here, I'm now a couple of decades in and haven't quite made my way back yet, but you never know where the future will hold. So, have been in California since and bounced around a couple of places previously, but I've been with an organization out here called Kaiser Permanente for any listeners that aren't familiar
It's a
for about
small
10
small
years.
organization, very small,
Small
very
organization,
small. Yeah.
you might say, yeah, minuscule. Um, and what I primarily do there is I help manage the mental health training program. So we have about 200 people each year that are training to become psychologists, social workers, counselors of different sorts. So I help do that and also do group and individual therapy. But most of my role is helping to manage that. And then, as you alluded to, outside of that, written 3 books. So previously, Real Happiness and the Happiness Toolbox, more overall general positive psychology, you might say, and then most recently awestruck, I should say, on the science of awe. And then that has been something that for the last 5 years or so, I've gotten a chance to go all around the country and at times even internationally, which has been
That's cool.
amazing to
Cool. Yeah.
talk about these topics. And it's funny when you were talking about where we connected, it was doing during one of these trainings, but
Hmm.
virtually. And it has been this strange silver lining. I mean, amidst so many other things in COVID, is doing all of this remotely. And you do these trainings and there's people popping in from all over the place and you're
Yeah.
connecting with really interesting people in some cases that you would have had no opportunity to meet previously. So I remember that well when you had some of the most memorable questions of the day. I remember that that
I'm engaging. Okay.
you were very
When I do
engaged.
my trainings, I do my part.
Many people just sit through the 3 or 6 hours to get their credits, but
uh,
you were there.
I like keeping my license, but I also like being engaged too. So it's
Great.
important. It's important.
That's fun. Yeah,
Um,
so most of my interest, I would say, ever since graduate school, I've always been really fascinated, but probably well beyond that, to be honest, of just what are the ingredients of a life well lived? What are the components of a good life? And is that something that we can actually work towards and achieve?
yeah.
Are these luck of the draw or habits, skills, behaviors that we can engage in? So that has really been the overarching
Mhm.
driving force energy wise for a lot of the writing and speaking that I've been fascinated in my career. And Now I find myself, I think, with a lot of people, having all these very divergent interests, and
Sure.
everything from psychology to well-being to philosophy and politics and all the circumstances we find ourselves with, and
Hmm.
figuring out how to make those piece together in some coherent way is kind of where I find myself, to be honest, these days.
Yeah, no, I'm totally with you. I mean, sometimes people, I've kind of mentioned this a few times now, but they'll ask me, they'll say, well, I mean, you do psychology, but I don't ever hear you talk about it that much. You're talking about philosophy, you're talking about race, you're talking about politics, and I think shortly enough, people will hear me talk more and more about my field. But it's one of those things where when you're doing it all day, right,
Yes,
is your sort of your other things that you want to do are not always in that. So, but I do think that there's a lot of transferable skills um,
100%.
throughout all of that. And I think I had said this on one podcast recently where it was, psychologists, are quote unquote experts in human behavior. And so why wouldn't we be considerate of how human behavior can um, manifest in different aspects of society, right? So I don't think we should just stay with psychologists or counselors or social workers or whatever. I think it's important to branch out and give perspective on other parts of society. So um, that's great. Maybe one day you'll come back to the East Coast, but I can imagine that being out on the West Coast. I mean, it's gorgeous over there, so
It is,
it's
although
probably
I'll
hard to
tell
get away
you,
from.
we're just sort of exiting fire season, and I have this existential angst every year for about 2 months, as we
Yeah,
just cross our fingers and hope that the fires don't move our way. And I will say, my urge to move somewhere, including back east, or just really anywhere that has nice nature and
yeah.
not being engulfed by flames, it definitely becomes more and more on my mind. So we'll see if one of these years it pushes me out, but for now it's good most of the time.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's sad that it's become something of like um, a yearly occurrence now. I think people outside of California probably forget about it, but it's devastating to a lot of nature, to animals, to humans, to lots of things. So it's really hopefully that's a problem we can work on getting fixed in the future. But it's definitely a deep challenge for you guys out there. Um, okay, so let's dive into I guess the big topic, and then we can trail off and see where we find ourselves. Um, Awestruck. So like I've mentioned, here's I'll give you my 30-second commercial about your book. um, so I read it the first time, it was really good. I read it the second time, kind of more just trying to see what I wanted to tease out. And I don't know, maybe this is intentional, you tell me, but the first half of the book feels almost like a very necessary lit review of all of the data and the science on awe and wonder and gratitude and all the rest. It felt that way, but it was. I mean, you did a nice job of doing it. Mixing certain anecdotes and stories and narrative, but it was nice because I think one of the things that you tell me what you think about this that is deeply troubling in my our field is I see one of two things happening. You get when you get a book for a popular audience, you get it where it's dry and boring and just doesn't land, or you get, which happens I think most of the time, where the science is watered down. There's not a whole lot of it in there at all. You get a lot of really weak science in there. And so it's a lot of platitudes. It's a lot of kind of motivational quotes. It's a lot of inspirational stuff, which, that stuff has its place, but it doesn't have a lot of substance behind it. And I thought that you had a really nice balance of that in the first part of the book to say, like, hey, like, this isn't just me kind of giving you my snake oil here. There's some like literature on this, psychological literature, and let me
Yeah.
tell you about that and present it in a good way. And then second half of the book is more, I would say, more of the applied piece of it, or more of the aspect of, how can we find awe in various things, in nature and, certain experiences or certain relationships. And it was a little bit more applied based on what you did in the first book. So that wasn't 30 seconds, but that was my 90-second commercial for the book.
Hey, well done.
Is that kind of what the intention was, or
Yeah, and I actually really appreciate you what you said, because that is exactly the needle that I'm trying to thread, to be honest, in my writing,
Mhm,
especially in this book, because it really is this dual targeted book, that I wanted to go beyond just the mental health practitioner sort of side of the coin
mhm,
and appeal to more people, but also point out to those in our field that this is something that can be quite useful, not only to our clients, to our patients, but to ourselves as well, and actually has some real evidence behind it. So yeah, in that first half of the book, to your point, I tried to, hopefully in a not overly dry way, but really reinforce that this is not just Jonah Paquette thinking that these moments of awe and wonder are cool and we should all do more of it, which by the way
mhm.
might be the case anyway, but that it actually affects our inflammation in our body. It affects our brain in different ways. It impacts our mood in lasting ways. It strengthens our relationships, and on you go, and all these different really powerful benefits. And then moving into part two of more, well, what do we do about that?
Mhm.
And that too was actually a very challenging section, I would say, to me, for me to write in some ways, because the answer, more so than even other parts of positive psychology or mental health in general, is, well, it totally depends on you as the person.
Right. Right. There's no
So
one size fits all here, right? Yeah.
yeah, it was taking this spirit behind it of, we should find those moments that make us go wow and evoke that sense of wonder, but recognizing on the one hand, how do I give some tangible, practical thoughts and suggestions to readers? And at the same time, the answer might be 10 different things for 10 different people,
Mhm.
because it is so personal, and giving room and space for that too.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that is always the hardest thing to do. Is I think for folks that have done empirical research, or they've, social scientist or any type of scientist, that's kind of the wheelhouse, right? We just years and years and years of doing a lit
Mm.
review and doing
Yep.
empirical, studies, and, just writing it up and all that. That feels, supernatural at a certain point. And then it's difficult to be like, oh, like, people don't torture themselves with, going to school and doing all this stuff for a reason. How do I then talk to people that don't want to do that and can
Yes.
understand it? And so sometimes that can be much more difficult to write. But I mean, I thought it was well done. I mean, that was very good. So
I appreciate that. Yeah.
all right,
And
so
I've
tell.
interestingly gotten two divergent bits of feedback from readers who, they'll hit me up at webinars that I'm doing and say, "Oh, I read your book," and I'm like, "Oh, thank you so much," because
Mhm.
it's honestly, it's always a thrill when someone actually has read your book or bought your book.
Yeah, I'm
I would
sure.
imagine if you get to the point where you're selling 100,000 copies, that maybe that wears off. But
Right.
for me, it quite honestly still comes as enough of a surprise to be really amazing.
Mhm.
But I would say half the people say something like, "Oh, I really love the first half, but if I'm being honest, it sort of fizzled out a little bit in the second half." And then the
Really?
other half of people will say, the first half was kind of dry, but the second half really got me going. So
So
you could,
all to say, there's a little bit of something for everybody in
there's
the
a little,
book.
that's a
You
good
might
intro.
like
That's
the
a good
first
reframe.
or the second half. That's my reframe.
If you find it fizzling in the first part, keep reading it.
um, okay, so tell us, what is awe?
Mm,
Give us the definition for all the listeners. There are some people that might pick it up and read it, but
mhm.
maybe people don't pick it up and read it. But what's awe?
Yeah. And, even after writing a book on it, you'll find that there's still different definitions on it. But,
Sure.
I would say shorthand, it's those moments that make us go, wow. It's those moments that fill us with this sense of wonder and possibility, where we might even get a shiver down our spine, feeling like we're in the presence of something bigger than ourselves that we can't really understand. A lot of the researchers, these scientists who study awe for a living, will, or at least as part of their career, tend to put together these two separate but connected pieces, in terms of an understanding of awe. And the first is that we encounter something that's vast, that's bigger than ourselves, which
Mhm.
importantly can be something in the physical realm, something that we see, touch, experience, or in the intellectual realm. So you can actually have this sense of vastness when you learn new ideas that shatter your assumptions, when you encounter a way of thinking that's outside of your norm. So something to do with scale is the first piece. And then the second piece is that it basically challenges our assumptions and makes us rethink what we thought we knew about ourselves or the world around us. And if anyone remembers ever, reading in undergrad about Piaget and child development, it's the idea of accommodation. It's the same concept of
Right.
you encounter something that's outside of your mental structures that you have to now absorb and take in and reflect. Yeah. So those two pieces, vastness plus accommodation, are the kind of
Mm.
formal definition of awe. But I always tend to think when I'm talking to people, easiest way to understand is, what is that feeling you get when you look up at the night sky, when you look up at a
Mhm.
beautiful sunset, when you watch a child take their first steps, that we all have these moments that we know we're in the presence of something bigger than just us
Right.
that we can't quite always put the words to, but we know it when we feel it.
Yeah, no, that's really nice, and I do like the way of distilling it in terms of the accommodation and then the vastness, right? Like those two kind of subsets of it. But I think some things that may be challenging for people is okay, that's cool,
Mhm.
but isn't that the same thing as feeling a sense of you know um, wonder or elation, or how is all is it, or and if it is, how is it separate from maybe more synonymous terms or synonymous ideas such as elation or elevation or wonder, or do you see those things as synonymous, or do you see them as
I see
somewhat
them as
distinct?
highly related. I mean, and it's interesting in some of this literature. As I was doing this, as you, I think, correctly put it, a lit review, which is even when you're long done with grad school, you're still doing these lit
Still
reviews.
doing lit reviews.
Um, Most of the researchers do tend to collapse wonder and awe into the same construct, and I think you can. I think one difference that you can see, and it might be a semantic thing, is that awe is not inherently always positive, whereas I think wonder, you always tend to usually have that positive connotation. So, when you ask people when's the last time you experienced awe, you get about 10 or 15% of the answers you get back are negative awe or threat-based awe or fear-based awe. And listeners might think of anything from the World Trade Center
Hmm.
to watching natural disasters. We were talking about the fires earlier, and you watch footage of that, and you
Yeah.
get a real sense of awe,
Hmm.
but you wouldn't call it wonder. So the ingredients might be similar, but the connotation's a bit different.
Hmm.
Elevation, I think is a fascinating emotional state, and we can even talk about that a little bit too. Uh, um, that I've heard best described as almost like the moral awe, in a
Hmm.
sense of the kind
Interesting.
of awe that we feel
Hmm.
in watching a person who's highly inspirational, for example, or feeling goosebumps when we listen to a speech by a great leader. You might get this feeling of elevation and connection, but a lot of the ingredients are similar. I would say with wonder, it's a little bit of that connotation piece of the
Hmm.
fact that awe is not always awesome
Yeah.
in that sense, in that sense of the word, but they're very similar constructs, I would say.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really important distinction, because I think I certainly didn't know that, and I think a lot of people would also be surprised to hear that. Oh, you're telling me that awe can be, we'll use it, shorthand, positive or negative,
Mhm.
or in some ways maybe you could say adaptive or maladaptive, right? Like I can feel some sense of awe if I'm watching um you know two animals fight on YouTube, in the wild, or
Mhm.
if I watch footage of uh 9/11 and
Mhm.
the World Trade Centers, or but then it could also be in the positive as well, right? Some sense of awe of um in a different way, whether it's natural or otherwise. And I can imagine that sometimes it probably doesn't matter how you classify it in some ways, in the positive. So here's what I mean. In the moment, right? At the end of the day, I guess it matters and it doesn't, but yeah, you tell me, in one sense, we're having, at the very least, a subjective experience internally and or externally, right? And so we're trying to quantify
Mhm.
what that experience is, what that emotional or affective experience is. And you can do that, in terms of subjective, meaning that it's, unique to you and how you're perceiving the world, but then it also could be a phenomenological experience as well. But I think in that way, does it matter in that sense? And so let's say you take positive all, let's call it that for a
Oh,
minute.
yeah. Mhm.
Could I feel, if I watch Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Had a Dream speech, I'm just choosing
Mhm.
a popular speech everyone will know.
Mhm.
I could feel a sense of awe, positive awe, let's
Sure.
call it.
Mhm.
And I could also feel some type of elation,
Mhm.
or I could feel some type of wonder in some ways.
Mhm.
Sometimes there might be some overlap of sorts.
Yeah, I would definitely say there's overlap in terms of those experiences. I would say just, an interesting, just to use that shorthand of positive or negative, one difference you would see, for example, if you're looking out at the Grand Canyon, just to
Hmm.
name another common example,
Yeah.
versus, watching those bears attack each other, for example, you might experience awe in a sense from either of those. Generally with, you know, I focus more in the book on what happens in our body and our brain, interpersonally with positive awe experiences, just to use that term again,
Hmm.
in terms of what it does for our health and our mood and all that. In some ways, what's really interesting, at least to me, is what threat-based awe does to us,
Hmm. Yeah.
which is, you don't feel relaxed and safe in the way that you do if you're just gazing up at the night sky and, or watching a beautiful sunset.
Hmm.
You feel small, but it's, there's more of that threat element. But it also still brings people together in really remarkable ways. We still, and you saw this even in famous example, 9/11 and other
Right.
examples. You see this on broader levels or individual levels that, even in these threat-based negative awe experiences, people identify much more with the group, much more
Hmm.
with the collective. It's a very
Yeah.
binding emotion, and it
Hmm.
also spurs altruistic behavior when we
Hmm.
experience it. So I think in that sense, we can actually see how and why awe in all of its forms was this really important, potentially important. I mean, hard to say, but from even a our existence as a species perspective, an evolutionary lens,
Hmm.
in terms of what it does to our communities and how we see other human beings and binding us together in that way.
Yeah, 100%. I totally agree with that, and I think that one of the things that I sometimes will, tell clients, or I'll tell, some of my friends, is that, you know experiences that humans have are, we don't have one emotion at one time, and sometimes we talk about it in that way, but I think, because it's, they're complex. But I think what you're saying is, you can have, hmm, it's a weird thing, right? Because the taxonomy is trying to explain, or trying to give a more robust answer for all of the facets of an experience, a subjective experience we're having. And
Mhm.
so if I'm um, in a certain place and it's, super awesome, I might feel, kind of this confluence of all of these emotions kind of in one moment, right? And
Mhm.
maybe you could, split hairs and say, like, this is the one, the umbrella emotion, and then here's all the other ones. But
Yes.
you could feel awe, wonder,
Mhm.
reverence,
Yeah.
respect, and then you kind of have some types of values of sorts that kind of come peek in there as well. But
Mhm.
so it sounds like it doesn't, it's not prescriptive of one event and one emotion. You can have
Yeah.
multiple and multiple, multiple,
Oh,
multiple
absolutely. And
emotions.
in fact, even some definitions of awe really have reverence and,
Mm,
deep respect, even fear at times. I mean, originally the understanding of awe had more to do with fear, actually, and it's, language evolving as it does throughout the years. It has more of a positive connotation these days. But yeah, I think all of the above. And to your point, I'm with you. I think we're much more complex creatures than sometimes this
mhm.
sort of modeling
Yeah.
can like, capture.
Well, yeah, I think that there's a um with some of the things that we have and some of the experiences that we have, you're right. I mean, I think that's just it, that we are fairly complex. And I'm curious, I can't remember if it's in the book, maybe it is. Kind of talking about fear, right? Fear is the traditional model of emotions, has fear as one of the basic emotions, right? Um, Other primates and other mammals have also have fear. But would you put all in a separate category? So for listeners that don't know, there's the traditional model is six basic emotions that we're kind of born with.
Mhm.
If people have seen the film Inside Out, they have five of the six, right? So it's
Great movie.
surprise, joy, fear, anger, sadness.
Mhm.
God, I can never remember all
It's
six.
disgusting.
Disgust. Yeah, that's
Okay.
something. And
I was,
disgust is more of like an emotional system
yeah.
at this point. But um, and then there's, again, traditional model in terms of development, usually around kind of 3 years, 3 or 4 years of age, we develop what's called social emotions, right? Also known as self-conscious emotions. And there's a few, but there's four major ones, which are shame, guilt, embarrassment, and pride. And there's actually two separate categories of pride. Where does awe, in terms of clusters, I guess, because I'm kind of talking about clusters and
Yeah.
stuff. Where does all fit? Is it I would see it as a separate category, no? Or how do you see it?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. I've actually never heard it posed quite this way, and you're educating me on this tonight. I love it. I don't think it fits in with the social emotions at all. I actually think it really is much more innate.
Mm,
Whether we want to call that sort of, it is a universal emotion, whether we want to put that with the so-called big six or not. But
mm-hmm.
I do see it as something that's much more core and universal and deep to who we are. And you know, uh, the sources of all will certainly vary when you look all around the world. I think there's a reason why, these types of moments um, are seen as so important, spanning all these different cultures and all these different philosophical traditions and all these different religious standpoints. There's something, I think, core and deep to who we are as human beings. Now, how that would quite be classified in that model,
Mm-hmm.
I'd have to chew on more, but I definitely think it goes beyond the social emotional realm.
Yeah, I think it would be, if I understand what you're saying, I definitely agree as well that I think it's probably more of a core of hu- human experience. So as I stated, that other primates and other mammals, um, as best we can kind of gather, have those basic emotions, right? But just because of how we understand how the
Yeah.
brain works, and mammalian brain, all that stuff.
Mhm.
But I I don't. I mean, I don't know, but I would guess, my cat doesn't feel awe. Maybe
I
he
think my
does.
I think my cat is just constantly in anger mode. So I doubt that she feels much. No, I think you're right. I think you wouldn't expect to see that even in other primates.
And yeah, I don't think bonobos or chimpanzees or
No,
orangutans. I don't think that they have a sense of awe. They may.
I think you need a little bit more of a sort of a sense of oneself in
Hmm.
the context of the world and the universe around you. I think you need that understanding of our smallness in a way to
Yeah.
really, and our transience and the fragility of life. I think you have to have more of that
Hmm.
self-awareness
Hmm.
to fully have those moments of awe and wonder.
Yeah. So I think, yeah. I'm kind of
Mhm.
trying the idea out. I think it's more of, I think you're right. I think it probably is core, but core to us as humans.
Yes. Yeah, yeah.
And I would think that awe or wonder or elation or some of these other types of emotions probably deserve their own categorization.
Hmm.
um you know who's going to do that and how they do that, it's whoever's, it's kind of like how it always is in science. Whoever gets there first gets the
Whoever gets
props,
there first. Yeah.
but
But I like that. I think it's core to who we are as human beings. Yeah, I would agree with
yeah, it specifically, which, and then then the big question which people usually ask is why.
that. Mm.
And I that might just be an easy answer, might be, well, that's how we evolved. just
Mhm.
like, other animals
Yeah.
evolved in different ways that we didn't. And so, I think it might be that's how we evolved. But, I think there's plenty of interesting ideas there. Kind of on that, I posted a tweet a couple days ago. I don't remember what it was. There was a big study done in the Emotion Journal, which is one of the premier journals for studying emotions. And gosh, Jessica Tracy, who's one of
Mm.
the giants. It's like her and Feldman Barrett and all
Mhm.
these guys, guys and girls that they're just giants in studying emotion
All the people that
research.
we geek out on that normal listeners will
Oh
be
yeah, there's no
right.
idea. But just so you know, there are people out there that like dedicate their whole lives to just researching emotions empirically,
Mhm.
and using certain models and theories.
Yeah.
Anyways, she published her and there's another author. I forget the first author actually, but and the whole big long uh, article on it. Maybe I'll post it in the notes of this episode. But and she and the other author, I'm forgetting his name, kind of were talking about this. They did 3 studies, and they were trying to understand different categorization, and which is kind of looking at how do
Mhm.
we group of sorts certain, because you're trying to quantify subjective experience, which is super hard to do empirically, but
Absolutely.
you're trying to find, okay, there's so many similar emotions now, and emotions that we name and label are trying to get at or tease out specific experiences that we're having as humans.
Mhm.
And that's the value, I think, of it. And so, in that way, as an example, they found that compassion is probably a bigger umbrella for empathy, sympathy. Um, I'm forgetting the other one. Is it
Mhm.
gratitude? I'm forgetting the other emotion that they put in there.
That makes
And
sense.
that you would look at, okay, you can see this as these are all compassionate elements, right? Or
Mhm.
these all have themes of compassion, but each one specifically has nuance that's important to
Mhm.
isolate. And they're all, so basically, in another way, they're on the same world, but they're a little bit different.
Mhm.
And so I wonder if um, all at some point could fit into that. There's an umbrella. Maybe it
Mhm.
is all, or maybe it fits under an umbrella emotion.
Mhm.
And then, there's a better taxonomy of trying to understand how emotions fit. What are your thoughts on that idea, I
Yeah,
guess?
I like that. I mean, and I think maybe that comes full circle to our exploration earlier of awe versus wonder versus elevation versus elation,
Right.
and versus surprise for, and there's flavors of each, and maybe we can understand what's the umbrella overarching some of these, and how do the specific experiences underneath um, differ and align as well. It's a fascinating. Yeah, that was I've been meaning to go back and actually read that piece in full,
Yeah.
but it looked very fascinating for sure.
Yeah. I read it once and I was like, yeah, I'm going to have to read this a couple more times. It was, there's just a lot in there.
I would.
There's a lot in there, but it was good. It was quality. It was very, I enjoyed it. Okay, so tell us a little bit about so we've kind of defined awe. We've talked a little bit about the classification or, thought about loud about how it could be classified or separated, but like, who cares? Right? Like, why does this matter? Who gives a shit? Right? Like, what this, like, whatever, right? Like, who cares? Why is this important for us as humans?
Good
This
question.
emotion of awe.
Um, Well, couple of things come to mind. I went through a lot of my life thinking about some of these moments, even if I wasn't quite calling them awe or wonder. When I think back to some of my absolute peak experiences, to borrow that term, in life, so many of them had to do with awe in
Mm,
one sense or another. But I'd always assumed, I think, going through my life that whether it was, being in Glacier National Park or, being in the water with great white sharks, luckily behind a cage, these different examples that come to mind for me that are
mm,
just, mind blowing. And I've always looked at them previously as being kind of a nice bonus experience in life. It's like you got
mm,
real life over here, and then you have these little moments that last 10 seconds, and you're like, oh, that was really exciting. But,
mhm.
Great.
Hmm.
What now?
Hmm.
And one of the things that's really surprised me in reading so much heading into this book and writing about it and talking about it is that, these moments are really formative in our lives, and these moments really
Hmm.
matter. And these moments, even if they feel brief, can actually have these wide ranging and long lasting ripple effects. So if you look at, some of the benefits or effects that we would say from these moments of awe, and we talked earlier how it brings people closer together. It's a very binding
Yeah.
experience,
Hmm.
in whether it's in pleasant or unpleasant circumstances.
Hmm.
It promotes altruism. It makes us more curious about the world around us. And those three right there, to me, if we think about altruism and connection and curiosity about the world, you can start to see why this would be so beneficial for all
Hmm.
human beings to have, right? In terms of how do we survive as a species? How do we,
Yeah.
promote our existence? That all of those are going to be beneficial, but then it goes way beyond that. And in my book, I write a lot about the effects of awe on our mood, and lifting our mood, and even having that last for a couple of weeks,
Yeah.
lowering our
How?
stress levels. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
Speak maybe. You don't have to do a huge deep dive, but
Yeah.
maybe a little bit. Of how does it, kind of impact us in terms of our mood or maybe even our physical well-being. These,
Yeah.
I guess, important moments of
Mhm.
awe. I have a separate question to that, but I'll let
Yeah.
you get that one first.
You know, physically, really interesting. I mean, it's you can't 100% make a causal link with some of these
Sure.
cases, but what appears to be the case is that awe is actually one of the most anti-inflammatory emotions that we
Hmm.
experience. So
Hmm.
the effect on our body's cytokine system, for example, markers of chronic inflammation,
Hmm.
awe has a much more powerful effect than anything else that's been studied, at least to this point, at least in my reading of the literature. So it actually heals our body, it appears, in these moments. It boosts our mood, as I mentioned, and best of all, that can even last a couple of weeks, according to some measures, for powerful moments of awe. So again, it's not as if you have this pleasant, this awe-inspiring moment, and then it's gone the next
Hmm.
second.
Hmm.
It lingers with us in
That
these
was my
really,
second question. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
that as much as a couple of weeks later. And then beyond just feeling better, it also, if you think about these two lenses, we might look at well-being of how am I feeling moment to moment, but also how do I evaluate my life, and more of that
Hmm.
life satisfaction lens. It
Hmm.
makes us see our lives in much more satisfying terms.
Hmm.
So when we experience these kinds of moments, it doesn't just happen in that moment, but it actually changes our perspective in these really powerful, or it can change our perspective in these really powerful ways.
Yeah. So that was my second question, which was, okay, fine. You're telling me all is important and it makes, less inflammatory and makes me feel a little bit more happier, cool. But that's just the moment, right? Like, how
Mhm.
do we take this from, kind of the language in our world is,
Yeah.
how do we take that from a state to a trait,
Mhm.
right? How do we make that from just some cool moments to something that has, uh, a longer half life? How does it have a ripple effect to have more long lasting kind of impact? How do you understand it to do that, I guess? Or does it depend on what the experience is?
It depends certainly on what it is. And I would say, I will informally sometimes talk about capital A awe and lowercase a awe. It's just a made
Hmm.
up term, but
Hmm.
I think we know it when we see it. Of
Yeah.
we go to the Grand Canyon, capital A awe. We
Hmm.
notice the changing colors of the leaves, and we have that brief insight of wow, how amazing to be alive right now, and to see
Hmm.
that,
Hmm.
lowercase, but still really amazing.
Hmm.
I think it's important to build in some of these experiences, and maybe we could talk about how to find more of that in life. I look at it really most of all in terms of a stance that we take in life, a way that we
Hmm.
engage in the world.
Yeah.
It's not so much about being prescriptive of I'm going to have 3 of these experiences a week.
Right.
Um,
Right.
but more that I'm going to sort of almost, yeah, I think there's a great Proust quote that's escaping me, but about the journey of discovery lies not in seeing new lands, but having new eyes, or
I,
through new,
I'm
something.
actually reading In Search of Lost
Really?
Time at the moment. I've
Huh.
I've taken the plunge and said, okay, I'm gonna
It's a
do
big
it.
plunge.
Read the 6 volumes, and
If I butchered the quote, then you'll let me know when that comes.
I've
But
I've read I don't know how many thousands of pages already, and I couldn't possibly remember it. But it sounds like something he would say. I mean, it's very poetic even in the English translation.
But as similar to mindfulness and gratitude, in a sense, it is this way that we engage the world that I think is the most important thing we have control over. Can I look around the room where I find myself? And it's easy to look like, oh, I'm in a spare bedroom, poor lighting. What's awe-inspiring here, right? And then I look around and you can just notice literally just in the field of vision, or even how we're talking right now,
Hmm.
this would be absolutely mind-blowing to somebody 50 years ago or 500 years ago or
Oh
5
yeah.
years
Oh
ago.
yeah.
And there's all kinds of ways that I think we can engage life more in that way.
Hmm.
What I would say challenges my assumptions, and maybe you feel similarly, if my perspective on change is kind of boring as a psychologist. It's that small changes maintained over time and repeated will
Hmm.
create new habits, and in turn, that's how we move the ship.
Hmm.
So whether it's practicing gratitude or mindfulness or developing self-compassion or practicing cognitive behavioral therapy, any number of these, it's sort of repeated over time, new habits.
Hmm.
In these powerful moments of awe, they appear both in sort of the fMRI studies done, but also the subjective reports. It operates almost like what you see a little bit in some of the psychedelic research. And you see some of these researchers who, like David Yadin, for example, like do both, right? Like awe
Hmm.
studies and now psychedelic research. And it's I think a similar subjective, but also it appears somewhat, objective looking at what's happening inside the body in these moments. And the reason I make that link is you have this, in these powerful moments at least, this capacity to really challenge us and change us in dramatic, lasting ways.
Hmm.
That it functions a little differently in that way, at least in my way of thinking, versus say doing a thought record or
Hmm.
a gratitude list.
Hmm.
So I'm still trying to wrap my head around that, to be honest, of how these brief moments can actually lead to a potentially a sea change for us
Yeah.
when they align just so.
Yeah. I have a variety of thoughts on that. So I'll start kind of with the things I hear a lot from different types of people. Some people will say, there's this. I think most people would admit that they greatly enjoy traveling, and I think this would probably be a primary way in which people feel some sense of um, awe, right? Um, I also enjoy it. I think you enjoy it, right?
Oh,
Whether that's
miss it.
yeah, me too. Whether that's international travel or that's domestically or whether that's in nature. Like some people can see it in cities.
Mhm.
Um, and sometimes I'll hear from people and they'll say, I just can't wait to just unwind and get away and get a break and travel and, kind of wanderlust and then, they'll go, they'll have a good time, they'll post a bunch of pictures online and all that stuff. And then, they come back and a week later and they're miserable again at work, and
Yes.
so I want, so this ties into kind of the second thought I have, but I'm sure you've heard this as well at some point. And so it is that kind of piece of how do we, again, go from state to trait? Because then it kind of feels almost like, I don't want to say an addiction, but it's just kind of like you're chasing all these
Yes.
moments, right? It's just, I need the next experience. I need the next, travel
Yeah,
place or whatever.
it's a great point, and I think you do see that happen, right? Of
Hmm.
on to the next thing, and almost this addictive kind of piece. And I think with all of these skills, we want balance between a number of them. We have to be able to sit in our own skin sometimes and just be. And sometimes we
Hmm.
can experience a sense of wonder of just, wow, I'm having a thought, I'm having an experience right now. How incredible! I'm aware of that. But I would say the other thing that comes to mind is just um, well, you could go a number of ways with that particular
Yeah.
example, but I think speaking just on awe, when we think about awe-inspiring moments, it has a lot of similar effects in our brain and our body and how we feel as when those moments really happen.
Hmm.
And I would say, whether it's in my own experiences, people that I know, clients that I work with, I think
Sure.
in that scenario, what sometimes happens is we go right to the point of sort of going away and we are kind of stuck in whatever mode we're in.
Hmm.
Once we are engaging those experiences, we are spending a lot of time sometimes still thinking about what's waiting for us back at home.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then when we come back home, it's like drinking water out of a fire hydrant. And
Hmm. Hmm.
it's as if the experience never happened.
Right.
So it's
Right.
not nourishing in that way.
Hmm.
And I think whether you want to call this part of awe or more savoring,
Hmm.
and drawing out the good, I think it's important to have these ways, not just posting it on Instagram, as you say, but
Right.
to
Yeah.
really
Yeah. Yeah.
engage
Yeah.
in those moments and make sense of them and reflect on them and ruminate on the good and think about what those
Hmm.
moments felt like and how they changed us. And so you're actually getting, I almost have the analogy in my head of an accordion where
Hmm.
you're stretching out a single moment, but you're actually getting a whole lot more out of it.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree, and so this is goes to kind of my second point, and maybe we're both on the same wavelength here. Is I wonder if, and I don't, I mean, you would know more than I would, but I wonder if this has to do somewhat with temperament and or personality,
Yeah.
because I think that there are some moments where it can be, okay, I have a good trip, I have a good moment, or I have a really memorable night out with my friends, and it just sticks in your head for years, and it's just you think about it with some sense of nostalgia or whatever.
Mm.
And I wonder if in some ways, and I'm not trying to make a value judgment on this, but I wonder if some people are, let's just use the colloquial, they're just wired differently.
Mhm.
They have just different temperaments where and it could be something else that is obstructing that, right? Maybe they
Yes.
are mildly or moderately depressed. Maybe they are have anxiety. Maybe they have um, other things that are, you know, again, kind of obstructing their ability to kind of reach back and still take from those moments of awe to have it apply long term when you're not in that state. What do you think about it being maybe potentially temperamental or
I think it's
personality?
spot on, and in fact, that rings true exactly what you see in that research. Actually, is and to, as you said, it's all of the above. It's hard to
Mhm.
partition out: is this genetics? Is it temperament? Is
Right.
it experiences? Is it trauma? Is it depression? Is it
Hmm.
where a person lives geographically and being in
Right.
a more oppressive environment versus not? So there's a lot of, but what you do see is that people are more or less awe prone, you might say.
Hmm.
Based on that combination of factors, and openness to new experiences, for
Hmm.
example, is more
Yeah.
linked to the experience of awe. So
Yeah.
even looking at personality factors,
Hmm.
there's been some research on character traits, and people that really have an appreciation of beauty or a love of learning tend
Mm.
to experience more awe. And it's a little chicken and the egg, of course, but
Sure. Yeah.
that is linked.
Yeah.
People all around the world experience it, but it's evoked by different parts of life,
Hmm.
oftentimes. So,
Yeah.
in the US, for example, a lot of people identify nature as their primary muse, but when they ask in comparison countries over in several East Asian cultures, the first thing people say is other people. And
Hmm.
all of that
Hmm.
person's wisdom, courage, knowledge,
Hmm.
that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, there are a lot of these differences, but I think to your point, you're spot on that whatever that causes, genetics, experiences, life, otherwise, modeling, that you do see these differences person to person.
Hmm.
And I would imagine, like with so many other things, it's just a normal curve that where you happen to fall is wherever that might be, more or less able to experience it as much.
Yeah. That makes sense intuitively, and again, if this is something that is more or less kind of seen in the literature, that again that would make sense. I guess I'm perseverating now. I'm
Good.
wondering about um there's this, for me, you tell me what you think about this. There's this idea that I've thought a little bit about this. Is Let's take nature, because I think that's an easy one. I mean, obviously you can feel a sense of awe and all the rest, and with people or with certain experiences or moments or in other places. But nature is like it's a little bit easier for me. I think that with nature, um, I see in some ways nature almost is an extension of ourselves as beings,
Mm.
and and it's not objectively or subjectively. It is the phenomenology, right? It is the inner workings of what it means to be in a moment or to experience.
Mm.
And there are some times where it's like almost innately, where kind of what you were saying at the beginning of like just these emotions go to the core. It's like why should we care about you know climbing the
Mhm.
top of a mountain or going down in a
Yeah.
canyon or seeing glaciers or whatever? Why does that register? And I think part of why that registers is my idea, but it is there's something I think primordial about how it harkens back to if you all the bits of what it means to be us, right? If we are an organism and we're a multicellular organism that's part of the planet, I can't help but think nature can provide some ways an externalization and by proxy an extension of our being itself. And so in ways there's a sense of how we can explore parts of ourselves in space, in nature, in different ways that we wouldn't otherwise. And I think that maybe not only is this an experiential thing, but I think it's also probably an emotional thing. Some people will feel, like we said before, other emotions when they're in nature. I mean, some people will, cry if they have like such a, connected moment. And I
Mhm.
think that there's an understanding a little bit, or there's an uncovering, right? There's a richer or deeper understanding potentially of ourselves by placing ourselves in the world or in nature in certain ways. So I'll give an example. um what was it, 3 years ago? uh, my wife and I, we went to Iceland, and it's
On
kind
my
of
list.
was very kind of climbing on the popularity list of sorts. But
Mhm.
and it's just it's a magical place. But there's something about, I don't know, I mean, it's all almost feels like an understatement.
Even from the pictures, it seems like it doesn't do it justice.
It's just but it's a weird thing, because when you're in that moment, I mean, you can apply this anywhere, but you'll use this as an example. You don't feel, you're looking at yourself in a different way. You've
Mhm.
never had that experience until that moment.
Mhm.
And when you have natural elements that are very different and or foreign to you, and then you're encapsulated in that, it can cause you to say, I'm having a novel experience by itself, but then I am because of where I'm at. And then you are learning something more about yourself.
Mhm.
And that, I think, kind of transcends, I think, objectively or subjectively. I think that that's a moment of being.
Yeah.
And it's a different modality, or it's a different mode of being that was unbeknownst to you before, unless you had that. Now, something I've thought about as well, and thinking of state to trait kind of thing is,
Mhm.
well, I can go I actually did this once. You could go to the same place and it's going to be a different experience, right? And you can try and recreate it, but it's
Mhm.
just going to be different. So, I don't remember when it was. I guess it was, I don't remember, 2014, 15. I don't remember. Now the years blur together, but I went to um, Acadia National Park. Have you been to Acadia?
No, we're
No?
had plans in October, and
Oh, no.
COVID got in the
Oh,
way.
man. It's amazing. It's
I've
super
heard
awesome.
someday,
um,
post-COVID.
yeah, I mean, look, I mean, listen, I mean, you live out on the West Coast, okay? You've been the
I
glacier.
shouldn't complain too
Come
much.
on. You've seen the redwoods. I mean, come on. I mean, come on.
Fair enough. I won't
It's
take
not
up.
that it's not that level of grandeur, but it for
It is
what it
beautiful.
is, and even outside of that, it's unique and it's special. But the first time we went as a family, and I mean, I wasn't expecting it. I heard things about it, but I wasn't expecting it to be that amazing. Bar Harbor is amazing. It's a quaint town, and um, the nature is incredible. And we went the next year. It was a totally different experience.
Mhm.
It's like even if you're trying to recreate certain states of awe, and
Yes.
even if it's with the same people, even if it's with the same space, even if it's at the same time, I think we went
Mhm.
like, we usually go in the summer. So it was just different. It wasn't better or
Yeah.
worse. It was
Well,
fundamentally different. And
yeah.
it was, and there is nothing different objectively
Mhm.
about, okay, I mean, Katie is still sitting there. It's been there. It's,
Yeah.
and there's something about that, I think, again, the experience of things. And so, kind of going back to this, again, state to trait, it doesn't have to be, I need a million, travel episodes to finally
Mm-mm.
get that, euphoria I want. It has to be almost, I guess, of how you're crystallizing it,
Yeah.
and then how it lasts after that. So I don't know. What are your thoughts?
And well, I have a lot of thoughts, and I'll probably jumble all of them. But
Yeah,
I
go ahead. Go ahead.
think to your point, novelty jumps out to me as far as
Hmm.
that element of surprise, the beauty that you see in a place that you've never been. The first time you see the Golden Gate Bridge, the first
Yeah.
time that you go to Acadia, I think that plays a role in this. I think the other piece is just we talked about how complex human beings are, right? And if
Hmm.
I happen to have more on my mind, or if I'm tired, or if I've had a shitty day,
Hmm.
what do those little micro things do to me? Those factors do to me if I'm in the redwood forest, right? I might
Yeah.
not feel awe. And then I think speaking of that, just the personal difference category.
Hmm.
I remember taking a friend to these beautiful to Muir Woods, they're called. If anyone listening has been, there are
Is
these
this out
incredible
in California?
out in California,
Hmm.
who was visiting, and I was very excited. Like, here's a real California beautiful place.
Yeah.
And I was there, and it's like my version of a cathedral. It's just,
Hmm.
370-foot trees, and just you could hear a pin drop. And to me, it's as close as you get to that.
Hmm.
My friend turns to me at one point. He's like, "So, is there anything else to see besides the trees here? And what do you want to? Where do you want to go grab a drink afterwards?" And
Oh
I'm thinking,
no.
but they're gonna find odd other places than I
Hmm.
am. So there is that sort of we can't presume to know exactly what we'll do. But yeah, I think to your point earlier, just about this connection, I think nature is a beautiful example of it
Hmm.
because it does have this very innate. I mean, I think it's why we want to see, why we have this urge to explore space as a species,
Sure.
and why
Yeah.
we're in
Yeah.
rapt attention collectively watching things like the SpaceX launch, right? Of
Oh
just,
yeah.
I think there's meaning that gets imbued with it. There's the sense that when we discover space, we're exploring ourselves and our origins. I mean, I think there's this innate draw that we feel. And then on
Oh
the
yeah.
flip side, when we're surrounded by four walls all day and concrete all the time,
Right.
what does our modern world do when it comes to depriving us of awe to some degree or another? Is I think an interesting thing to reflect on too.
Yeah. No. Certainly. I think. Yeah. I'm I'm working on a piece now about space, um,
Wow.
and it's super hard to try and describe that. But um, I've just been thinking about it a lot. I've had clients bring it up, and I friends, and even for myself. And I'm not going to regurgitate it here, but I think that my idea is that we have this arbitrary function of putting certain activities or events in certain spaces. But in reality, you don't need to necessarily do that. We do that for a particular reason, right? I don't need to go and work in a particular space. Obviously, some people do, but I don't need to go and work in a particular space. I don't need to necessarily go to a gym. I don't need to necessarily go to a bar or a restaurant. If I'm just trying to exercise, if I'm just trying to eat or drink, if I'm trying to make income, for it's different for everybody, but in the general sense, for people that are working from home and everything this year, they've had this on top of everything, this kind of existential dread. And I just thought about that for a long time. I was like, what is it? I mean, just people are in homes with, I mean, it's obviously the socialization of piece of it is the lack of that is great, but people got their Netflix and their Wi-Fi and their Uber Eats and their Amazon Prime, and they're working from home. And for people that are in that situation, like, it's not bad. Like, I mean, it's just, call it privilege or whatever you want, but I mean,
Mhm.
this isn't 1917, 1918, and people are just like, they don't have running water or electricity. I mean, there's so
No,
many
and
things.
it's a good reminder of as much as we all colloquially will say 2020 is the worst year ever. And by the way, I mean, if you are have a loved one who's, there's of course exceptions where it really could feel
Sure,
that way.
sure,
But
sure.
looking broad view lens, would anybody who's saying that trade places with somebody from 1918, or let alone 1960 or 1980? Probably not. I
Right.
know I wouldn't, even in spite of
Right. Right. And that's my point. But then,
it.
I kind of push past that, and I was like, okay, what is it? What is it? What is it?
Hmm.
And I think it's this intangible, nebulous concept of space.
Mm.
And I think what's happening is people are having their boundaries blurred, and having things or activities in different spaces allows different parts of you and who you are to manifest, but also to potentially be maximized. And when you have no boundary
Mhm.
with space, you have almost no boundary within yourself.
Mm.
And when you're doing that, there's this chaos, there's this collision. And when that's happening, people are disoriented. They can't focus. They're, maybe more prone to depression. They're, all these things. And I think that there's this interesting and extremely important utility for understanding and respecting the, again, the phenomena and the utility of space. So,
Mm.
it's, I think it's the pandemic is teaching us a few things. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but
That is for sure. No, I love those thoughts on it. So when's your piece coming out on it?
I don't know. I'm trying to do it by the end of the year.
Well, I've been loving your writing, by the way. You've
Oh, thanks.
medium,
Thanks.
great pieces.
Yeah, and I'll try and expand it a little bit more, and maybe put other places. But yeah, it's I do so much input. I wanted to do more output. So
Mhm.
the writing and podcast and other projects I have, I teach, and so, and then work and family. So I'm doing more output, and
You're a busy guy.
yeah, I try to keep myself busy, but I want to do more output than just input.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
okay, so let me just branch out a little bit here. Unless there's anything you wanted to say more about all. I'm sure you could you
No,
could you
that's
could write books about
I could
all the
write
things you
book.
could say.
I could talk about it for hours. No, I think we've covered some good ground with it, and there'll
Yeah.
always be some stones on, but we have to leave a few stones unturned. That way, a couple of listeners might
Oh,
actually
for
check it out.
sure. I want them to read it, so pick it
There you
up and
go.
read it, and
So,
so
yeah, we'll branch out wherever we want.
um so just, I guess, more generally, and then we'll branch out even further. So this fits within positive psychology.
Mhm.
I think, right?
Mhm.
They're closely aligned.
Yeah.
Um Tell me, I mean, you would know this more than I would. So uh I had a terrible, hate affair with positive psychology, early 2000s. I thought it was a bunch of crap.
A
Um
lot of it was.
and now not so much. But tell me just kind of what's your, criticisms or
Mhm.
positive aspects, but what's your kind of pulse on where that subset of psychology is currently today, and where you see it going, and
Well,
things you like, things you don't like about it.
I think it's actually evolved a bit over the last couple of decades in a way that probably speaks to why you like it more now. I think a lot of the
Mm.
early uh, aspects of it were a little too Pollyanna-ish. Um,
Yes.
were sometimes a little skimpy on data. So
Oh,
kind
it
of,
was woo woo to me. It was just
yeah.
like, oh yeah, just very like Eastern, and like, let's find your, your third eye and all this stuff. And it's just like, oh
Yes.
gosh,
And
like,
big claims often made on sort of small data sets. And
yeah,
I
yeah.
think there were some methodological issues. I think there was a perspective issue. I think what you've seen a lot more of is, if we look at the good life, the life well lived, well-being as a whole, whatever you want to think about that as,
Sure.
which is where my fascination is. It's not just about feeling good, right? I mean, we have to have pain in there. We have to have
Yeah.
hardship. We have to have anguish. We have to have heartache. We have to have resilience. We have to have overcoming. So I think if we look at the full life, all of that has to be there. And so if you're
Mm.
really interested in studying a life well lived, it can't just be about feeling happy all the time. It can't just be
Mm-hmm.
this hedonic model of happiness that I think sometimes it previously, there were exceptions, but that it would fall into.
Mm-hmm.
There wasn't always a depth to it. I think that more recently you've seen a little bit more of a turn into. But fields are interesting because there's always the corrections and the overcorrections and the
Sure.
recorrections. I think
Right.
where some of it has gone into almost to a fault has been incorporating a lot of the neuroscience of well-being, which, don't get me wrong, is fascinating,
Mm-hmm.
but it's also, I think, oversold at
Yeah.
times too in terms of some of that.
And correct me if I'm wrong. Is it the overselling where it's, basically trying to say that, again, I'm going to make a generalization
Mhm,
here, but is it, you know, here are some findings. We found it in the brain, so see, it's
mhm,
good for you.
mhm,
Yeah, it's just kind of this like, here's this finding, and it found like, this well-being connects with, your the amygdala or your frontal lobe, and
mhm.
see, this is, it creates more neuroplasticity, and see, it has brain, that kind of thing. Or is it more of just like, people still have this kind of like fetishizing of fMRI studies, which, they're fine, but they're
Yeah,
not, they're
I think it's a little
not,
bit.
they have limits.
You still have the fetishizing. Sometimes you just have very incomplete sort of, hey, when we're doing something that makes us feel good, parts of the brain that are associated with making us feel good become active. Big
Hmm.
surprise.
Hmm. Right, right, right.
And then it's sort of like, well, okay, that's great. But I think sometimes you have these very banal findings that are under the sort of the guise of, well, here's a cool brain scan to show why it's
Hmm.
something not just meaningless. But these are minor quibble. I think on the whole, it has come a long way. It's matured, as most fields would, if after 2 decades.
Sure, yeah, yeah.
So
And where do you
yeah.
see it going? I guess, right. It's roughly about 2 decades, I guess now, or a solid 2 decades into it. For better, for worse, where do you kind of, see it going in some directions, and maybe they give you concern, or maybe they give you a lot of, optimism, or where do you see it going? I guess.
Where I would like to see it go might not be where, but I would say where I'd like to see it go is really looking at more of a personalized medicine standpoint of
Mm,
how do we know what works for whom and when and why,
mm,
which I think are really hard questions to answer in the social
no,
sciences. But
absolutely.
I think that sometimes it's a little too much of a broad brush of, well, gratitude is good for you. And most of the time it is, but there are certain circumstances where it's not so adaptive or it's not so helpful. And, so I think having a little bit more nuance to that would go with that.
Mm,
I think it's also been at times a little narrow in its focus of just, what are the types of things valued in the US or in Europe.
yeah.
It's a very Western, at times very male
Hmm.
viewpoint on some things,
Hmm.
which I think is incomplete.
Mm,
Now, I would say on the flip side, criticisms of that can sometimes be a little not good faith, also, because I think it's, that's not always the case. And I think it's very easy to dismiss ideas because of who is saying it as opposed to engaging the idea itself. And I think that's always an important kind of
yeah.
nuance. But yeah, I would say on the whole, if we could draw from more types of expertise and
Mm.
more viewpoints, it'll be better.
Yeah, I could see definitely I don't want to say crossover, but more of an integration with um, health psychology. I could definitely see more of that there.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, this is a while ago now, but when I was doing my uh, dissertation research on shame,
Mm.
um, one of the things at the time that was kind of sort of being pushed in the, I guess you could say, international literature more than U.S.
Mhm.
literature, was this emphasis on quality of life.
Mhm.
Um, and I don't know if it's still that way or if it's just kind of turned something different. But I could see also something on right, kind of what you're saying, a Western perspective. But how do we understand it cross culturally and internationally?
Mhm.
And um, right, well being, quality of life, whichever term you want to use
Mhm.
of understanding that, kind of around the world, I think is would be nice to see as well.
And speaking of health psychology, I mean, I think one big area that a lot of positive psychology has not always paid attention to, and in some ways because it views itself as separate, and maybe that's fair, but is just about anything to do with the body and anything to
Hmm.
do with lifestyle and
Hmm.
anything to do with sort of those parts of life. And
Yeah.
when we do our positive psychology class that we have for our members in our clinic, we have a whole week on mind body and a whole week on movement it's
Mm.
not about prescribing exercise necessarily, but just getting our body moving and eating in certain ways so that we're
Yeah.
not just stress eating when we're feeling overwhelmed, and fairly basic stuff around sleep. But point being, you could practice all of the self-compassion and gratitude and
Hmm.
mindfulness and all that, but if we're sleeping like crap and we're eating like crap and we're
Right.
barely moving and we're sitting on our couch all day, it's not going
Right.
to do a whole lot, right?
Yeah. No. No. I totally agree. Um, and sometimes that can be hard. I do think this
Oh yeah.
comes down to, uh, in some ways, not always, but it can come down to personality or temperament, or sometimes it
Mhm.
can be some of the motivational pieces of it. And I guess just kind of to close this here, that topically is, what are just kind of your uh, ideas or observations on? I mean, I have to imagine you have plenty from kind of looking at all
Mhm.
during you know the pandemic we've had this
Mhm.
year. I mean, it has to be such an interesting lens to look at all that stuff. What are your kind of thoughts on that? I
Yeah,
guess more generally or whatever.
it's a great question. I would say even there my feelings have changed on it
Mm,
because
mm.
I my first personal reaction was, wow, what a bad time to release a book on awe when everyone's inside. And then, as somebody who experiences awe so much through certain parts of the world that were, at least for a while, cut off from me,
Hmm.
it felt very challenging. But what I've tried to tap more into is just, again, that stance through which I engage the world. And we talked about a Proust quote that I butchered earlier, so I'll probably butcher this one too. But I'll do it. It was an Einstein quote, which is that there's two ways to live your life.
Hmm.
One is as though like nothing's a miracle, and the other is as though everything around us is a miracle.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I have found myself, and I've encouraged clients working through this lens as well a lot, is to just, I mean, just our existence is incredible to wrap our head around, right? Like just
Hmm.
the ability to suffer the way that we do during a pandemic, just the ability to have had as many ancestors before us survive long enough to pass their genes along so that we can be here.
Hmm.
For us to be the one egg and sperm I mean, there's all kinds of ways that you can go.
Yeah.
And in that way, I think awe, gratitude, mindfulness, they all come together in this nexus that's become really apparent for me in this during this pandemic, even though there are different constructs. But
Hmm.
when we're aware and we're in the here and now, we can see how much wonder there is around us. And when we
Yeah.
notice all the things that are good in our environment, what a sense of awe that can give us. And I've found myself really resonating a lot more with the small parts of life, at least through a lot of this pandemic, and
Mm.
things that we take for granted,
Yeah.
frankly, that we have
Yeah.
blinders on, that really are magical if we see them that way.
Yeah, I completely wholeheartedly agree with that. I think, also I think for myself as well is I've done a lot of things this year, and a lot of thinking and talking with different people, but I think I'm just I'm reminded of something Nietzsche used to say a lot in different ways, but you can't circumvent suffering. It's going to happen. And instead of trying to, and this isn't a direct quote, I'm
Mhm.
butchering or paraphrasing one of his aphorisms, but it's, you can't go around it or above it or under it. You have to go through suffering, because that's the thing that gives the most character for
Mm.
people.
Mhm.
It would be wonderful if it didn't, maybe in some ways, but and so people shouldn't look for it. It's going to happen to you at some point in your life,
Whether you
and
want it or
different
not.
types. And maybe that's that kind of negative all of sorts, but it is
Mhm.
one of those things where it's like, you know, yes, the world is, you know, had a, at least for humans, it's been a pretty tough time this year. But I think that there's so many, it's not silver linings. It's just, there's just so many moments of reckoning for oneself and their habits and their behaviors and their relationships and what they prioritize and their hierarchies. And like, there's just so many, if you allow it, ways to, you know, really take stock in some of those things. And then how do you kind of reset? And when, society goes back to quote unquote normal, how much more purposeful could you be? Um,
Mm.
and not, allowing the kind of the ambiguity of life to dictate and determine your own life. You can do it in the way that you want. And so I don't know. I think that there is it's tough, and there are so many people that are, you know, at the very least have died, have been sick, will have medical complications or mental complications.
Mhm.
People have lost jobs, they've lost. I mean, there's just so many horrible things,
Yes.
and yet I think that there's, for many folks, so much potential for growth too outside of it. So I think it's
I think both are true, right? I mean,
yeah.
we can not invalidate the very real pain that's been there for so many people, and at the same time,
Mhm.
how do we grow as people? How do we become our
Right.
best selves if not through that pain? If we could magically wave a wand and have life free of hardship,
Hmm.
we should think long and hard about that. It's not a very good bet.
Right.
We're not going to grow. We're not going to be good humans. We're not going to love. We're not going to laugh. We're not going to live to our fullest if
Right.
life doesn't have those valleys. So, yeah, I think to your point, a lot of people will have that reckoning and that choice of whenever that whatever normalcy is anymore comes back. Who do we want to be? How do we want to live? How do we want to engage this journey
Yeah.
of life?
I I totally agree, and I think that that's the important thing there. Okay, so I guess let's something a little bit different. I definitely wanted to talk with you about all, but I don't. I like people to talk about what they work hard on, but I also like people to see kind of the more
Mhm.
uh, multifaceted aspects of people I have on here. So I don't want people to just see you as the positive
The all
psych
guy.
all guy. I mean, there's definitely that, but
Yes.
okay. So let me ask you this.
As long as we don't talk about the New York Knicks, anything else is fair game.
I was just reading today that the season starts like in December or something. So weird. I
Oh, it's
can't
right
get
around
used
the
to that.
corner. I'm so thrown off with everything.
Yeah, I can't. I'm like, it just ended, and then like it's starting again. Like it's so strange. Um. Okay. So here's my question. One
Mhm.
one question I have for you. Um. Should it's a general statement. You can make it specific to you, or more specific in another way. Should psychologists be politically involved and or inclined? And if so, why?
Mm.
Your opinion.
Yeah, I'll speak just from my own perspective.
Opinion's your own.
And I'll tread carefully along third rails here because
Okay.
I know and I'll speak freely here. I think my perspective, by the way, is that as long as something is done with good faith, with compassion, with curiosity, with benefit of the doubts, like we'll have
Mhm.
conversations. I think we should have more conversations about difficult topics
Yeah.
without worrying about landmines. So
Mhm.
with the caveat being, I think that there would be many people in my world, in my neck of the woods, as probably with yours, whose perspective would be we should never have separation. We should always sort of have therapists as activists or psychologists as activists. I think my boring answer is it depends. I think as a citizen, it's great and appropriate to engage with ideas and have causes that we believe in and to try to make the world a better place and not just hide behind this shield of whatever that looks like of our professional standing. That said, I think I'll tell you from my clinical perspective, when somebody's coming into my office,
Mhm.
they're complicated beings and
Yeah.
people construct who they are through countless lenses, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how they see themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a dangerous assumption sometimes that, if somebody disagrees with me on something, that somehow that has to enter the therapy office, that I'm
Mm-hmm.
going to call out problems at every turn. And I think if a person's coming in because they want help with OCD or panic disorder,
Mm-hmm.
that's going to be my primary goal.
Right.
Whether I voted differently from that person or not
Right.
really shouldn't be the issue. So I think it's a yes and a no. I think it's good to be civically engaged. I think, to me, one of the best things that came from this election was just how high the turnout was. I think if
Oh
we
yeah.
lived in a world where 90% of adults who were eligible voted, like everything would be better. So
Mm-hmm.
that thrills me.
Yeah.
So I think it's great to be engaged and to do what we can to make the world a better place in whatever aspect it's meaningful to us. But I think there is a danger too of overplaying that, where we see ourselves completely fused with an activist self,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and I think you see this sometimes in our fields at times where
Yeah.
it becomes less about how am I going to help this individual
Mm-hmm.
versus you know what are the causes that I want to promote. And to be honest, I think sometimes what's good for the individual in terms of self-empowerment, in
Mm-hmm.
terms of personal responsibility, in terms of thinking about how can I build their self-efficacy and help them create a better life for themselves,
Mm-hmm.
can get lost and almost be at cross purposes a little bit with more of a, I would say, if you take more of a defeatist lens, for example, or
Right.
a lens of, you're constantly going to be marginalized and screwed over in this life. So how, let's throw up our hands. So I think
Mm-hmm.
it's a really fascinating question that I'm rambling on, but my thoughts
No,
go to
you're
a lot
fine.
of
You're
places
fine.
with it. Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, I have strong opinions on this.
Good.
Strong opinions on this. Um, so I think just generally, I mean, well, I'll say this. I think there's a lot of dimensions to this. Um, I guess number one, you're more in the cognitive behavioral therapy camp clinically in terms of
Yeah, that's where
like like
I would say most of my training was. Yeah.
okay.
But
So
I consider myself kind of a humanistic
okay.
existentialist at heart, but
Okay.
and
Okay.
I play a cognitive behavioral therapist for a
Yeah, so I'm more psychodynamic
Mhm.
for those that don't
Mhm.
know. It's rooted in Freud, and there's kind of a more contemporary lens on that. I was actually trained in the three major theories:
Wow.
theory and therapy, psychodynamic, CBT, cognitive behavioral, and family systems. But
Mhm.
I conceptualize individuals psychodynamically, but in the world of managed care where people come in with insurances,
Yes.
I do a lot of CBT interventions as well,
No
and
doubt.
then yeah, I think more there's a blend. I have a nice blend of I think existential humanistic, but
Mm.
so kind of traditionally in terms of talk therapy or psychotherapy, there's the whole historical approach of kind of the blank slate. You never say anything about yourself. It's kind of the historical approach, and then there's been a lot of iterations and a lot of changes to that of how the therapeutic relationship works. But I don't think that mm, psychologists and or therapists should be completely silent on things, as if that's not a mode for them.
Mhm.
I mean, obviously the client is the focus, right? And it's the individual is the focus. It's not about the therapist necessarily, right? But I think this kind of blind, never say anything, and you never have
Mhm.
a position on things.
Mhm.
It's probably a little bit too extreme.
Yes, I agree.
I I have strong feelings though about in either direction of mental health professionals. I'll broaden it, but
Mhm.
psychologists, social workers, therapists, counselors. Um, being activists, um, definitely in the therapy room. Uh, maybe personally they want to do that. That's cool,
Mhm.
but I don't. one of the things in terms of the ethics is you want to maintain objectivity, you want to try and maintain neutrality, you want to try and maintain competence. And if you have a certain position you strongly believe in that is going to obfuscate your ability to see the human or the person and then for them to make their own decisions,
Mhm.
that is not coloring things right. And I think that that's a poor lens and your biases are going to get in the way, even if it is doing that unbeknownst to you. And so I think that there has to be some balance, I
Mhm.
think, for uh, psychologists and mental health professionals. And I become quite frustrated because I think if clients perceive that or see that, it's less likely that they're going to be more open. And it's
Mhm.
less likely that they're going to find the empowerment in what it is. And so, I'll speak very generally, but
Mhm.
I've heard therapists say, "Oh boy, if I get a client that's a Trump supporter, I can't see them." Like, that's not
Yes,
good.
I've heard the exact same thing. I've had even colleagues say, I don't think I could treat a person that voted differently than me in this election. And obviously being out in California, you know which direction that's heading, being in mental health in California. And, you know, to me, it's very different if a person has had a certain experience in their life,
Mhm,
traumatic in nature, that for a very rare type of patient, they
mhm.
they come in and, I'm just not capable of treating this person. It brings up too much
Certainly,
for me. Maybe I've got work
certainly,
to do on that, whatever.
yes,
To me, if you're saying 75 million people I just refuse to see, and probably
right,
countless more that think similarly. To me, and I'll just be blunt, to me, that's you as a mental health therapist failing at your job. That I think you need to do some work on yourself at that
yeah,
point.
yeah, yeah,
And how many of those people are actually people of decency and have
mhm,
50 other parts of who they are? I mean,
mhm,
this is where you start to get into some of that identitarian stuff that I think
yeah,
is so toxic. Of,
yeah,
well, is that true that you wouldn't treat the person who's, d- would it matter what ethnicity they were or what
right,
orientation they were?
right,
And if they were an immigrant, and suddenly, like, you start to flatten people's lives and who they are
mhm.
into this checkbox of who did I vote for? And man, I think we've really lost our way if we start to go down that road,
Yeah,
which
it
we've
it
already started to go down, I think, to me.
yeah, well, that's there is already enough bullshit that we have to uh, dispel all the time in our profession, right? All these things we have to say, that's not what it does. That's not what it is. And there's so much correcting for that.
Mhm.
Um, Not in a way of how do we legitimize our profession? It is legitimate, but it's more of trying to correct for misinformation or, old kind of tropes that, I mean, I still have, you know, clients that will say, if it happens, I don't want to go to the hospital. I don't want to, they start painting, one flew over the cuckoo's nest. It's like that's not how it works anymore. That's not how patient
Mhm.
hospitals are. And so there's still old ideas. If if we have clinicians that are, I mean, there's already, I mean, you know this. I mean, if there's already challenges within training programs in psychology already, that's a whole other podcast.
Yes.
But
That'll be part two.
yeah, but as clinicians, if you're doing work, that's a big problem if you can't see someone because of who they voted for. And I agree, you have more work for you. For example, if somebody comes in and they say, "Hey, doc, I want can you see this client and they have uh, an eating disorder and they're trying to get treatment for this, blah 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 blah."
Mhm.
And I'm going to say, no, I can't do that. And the reason I can't is because I don't have that takes specialized training. I don't have the competence. Um, and so I
Mhm.
can't see that person. The reason for the rejection of sorts is my incompetence, my lack of training in that specialized area. It's not, oh, this person must be blah, blah, blah because they
Mhm.
came in with a MAGA hat.
Yes,
And you can do this the other way too. I mean,
of
it's
course.
somebody that
Yeah.
comes in with certain types of ways or certain ideas
Hmm.
that's extremely liberal or sort of extremely
Hmm.
left. And so I worry about that. I worry about that. So then I guess the kind of to the question I was saying was, how how can psychologists or clinicians, can they be political, but what extent and how much does it integrate and does it not? And that kind of, I guess, debate, I guess. you
Well,
know
I would say just to, on the flip side, I think our field often draws pretty well-intentioned people that are inclined, whether based on temperament, whether based on worldview, politics, to be for the little guy, so to speak.
yeah, yeah.
And so I think there's a well-intentioned quality where we do value equality, and we do value, these are broad strokes, but we do
Right.
value treating people equally, understanding the context that if I'm working in a very impoverished neighborhood, right,
Hmm.
and I'm there's a lot of trauma and there's a lot of history of racial injustice there.
Right.
If somebody comes in with anxiety, I'm also not being, on the flip side, I'm not being a good clinician if I'm only looking at their symptoms and I'm not taking in that broader
A
context
hundred
of life.
percent. 100%. Yeah.
But I think that has a risk of being an overlearned sort of tendency too,
Hmm.
where I stop seeing that person as the person that
A
they are.
person.
And
Right.
yeah, and I've had countless examples of me making even unconscious assumptions about a person based on how are they going to think about this, or how
Hmm.
if they mention the election they're probably going to say this, and then them surprising me, right?
Hmm.
Whether it's a
Hmm.
person who's looks a certain way,
Hmm.
who turns out to be in favor of President Trump, as it were.
Hmm.
So I think we know on the one hand that people are complex beings, and yet we forget that when it comes to talking about certain issues or having certain things come up. As far as your question, I think it's a good one. I'll speak to where I how I
Sure.
tend to be
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
I'm easy to find. I'm on not that I'm a super active Twitter or Facebook person, but it's under my name. It's
Right.
I'm easy enough to find.
Right.
If someone is so inclined that they want to look me up, it's a public profile. They can see if I've retweeted something from President Obama.
Hmm.
They'll see if I've commented something about the Trump administration that I didn't particularly care for.
Hmm.
You can look up publicly who people donate money to. If you
Hmm.
want to go to a rally, you can do that. I mean, so I think we should feel free as human beings to not be completely wed to our professional identity, where
Right.
that dictates how we engage in the world.
Right.
And that said, when we're in that professional identity, maybe I'm old, so I know I'm out of step with how a lot of my even colleagues would talk about this. But I think
Hmm.
we do need to take a step back sometimes and ask ourselves, this is a person coming in for a service.
Yeah.
Why are they coming in?
Hmm.
What do they want to get out of this experience? What
Hmm.
are their goals? And frankly, if I have different movie tastes than them, or I voted differently, I think that's okay.
Hmm. Right. I think, yeah, I completely agree. And I don't know. I mean, if I'm honest, if I'm honest, how I treat people clinically,
Mhm.
it's just how I view, it's my worldview and my philosophy of how I view people in general. Um, Meaning, I always start with the individual and I start with the person. Um, and then I move outside of that and I see all the particulars.
Mhm.
But that's how I that's how I
Mhm.
see my friends. That's how I see my family. That's how I see people I meet. That's how
Yeah.
I don't, I'm not inside their mind. I don't know what they're thinking. I don't know what they're feeling. And have this bottomless well of curiosity about that individual.
Hmm.
And if I only say, well, this is a black woman, or this is a
Hmm.
Latin man, or this is a, whatever, pick your
Hmm.
category. And that's my starting point.
Hmm.
That's a disservice to me, understanding the true value of the, or I don't say value, but learning the true element of who they are as a person, as a being.
Hmm.
And So I think that in that way, it's challenging because, you know, I think people should have their opinions and they should have their beliefs and they should feel it strongly, and that's wonderful.
Hmm.
But you're right. When someone's coming in for a service,
Hmm.
if I was going to, I mean, I've had therapy in
Hmm.
many years past and all that stuff. But if I was going to therapy now, I wouldn't want the therapist to say, okay, well, he's a guy and he's this racial category, so this
Hmm.
must be X, Y, and Z things about him. And all the rest, I would be like, um,
I'm going to the next therapist.
listen, I mean, that's true. I mean, I'm half Latin, and you better believe there's always beans stored in the pantry. I mean, I can't. I mean, beans and rice is a staple. I mean, I can eat that any day of the week. But um,
Uh,
I also like different types of foods, and
yes.
I listen to different types of music, and
Yeah.
I read
You-
Hegel in my off time. I'm not reading something else. If you were to just know things about whatever category, and then make some, general assumptions, and that's all you went, you're going to miss me as an individual. And I think that's the thing, right? Is you can't just look at symptoms. You can't just look at problems with people. You have to look at who they are as a person and be, again, this endless amount of curiosity about the antecedents or the unconscious themes or whatever you want to use to get at that. And I just wonder, you know, can can people do that outside of a therapy room? Can they do that outside of working with clients? And then in the reverse, if therapists are coming and they aren't doing that, they'll be
Yes.
like, yeah, well, this, and this, and then I'll find out who you are. I just think that that's flip. I
And
don't
my
think it's
my
wrong. It's
my
just flip.
suspicion, to your point, is I think a lot of people who operate like that do the same thing outside of the room, right? And
Right, right.
they're painting people in the broadest of brushes, and you know, on an extreme level, imagine going to a surgeon, and
Hmm.
as soon as the surgeon finds out that you voted for Joe Biden, that
Hmm.
particular surgeon says, "Well, I don't think I can operate on your knee." We
Right.
would rightfully think that that was not a good way to have the world be,
Hmm.
and yet somehow it's acceptable when it comes to other parts of life. But I'm with you. I think the one of the most powerful services we can give clients, give patients, is this true, genuine sense of curiosity about who they are in the world.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it's great to have your intake paperwork that tells you the broad stroke demographics. Okay, that's fine,
Right.
but please don't let that be a replacement. Any if there's any upcoming therapists listening, a replacement for understanding who they are as an individual. And sometimes you do have this devolving of things with trainings on, say, specialized populations, and it
Right.
becomes a very broad brush presentation of it's almost like you take a broad group average and you say, okay, on average, group X is 22% more likely to have this characteristic, and therefore we
Hmm.
should assume that everyone in group X has. No, that's not the way this
Right.
works.
Right.
And asking a person, I see your information here on the sheet, on the paper, but I really want to know before we even get into all this, like, tell me about you.
Hmm.
What are the parts of you and your background and your identity and your
Hmm.
experiences that are salient for you? Tell me who
Right.
you are as a person. And I think if we start from that point, which includes all that stuff, by the way, it
Of
includes
course.
if they've been
Right.
traumatized, it includes if they've experienced racism, sexism,
Right.
feeling marginalized, it includes, trauma, it includes all that
Hmm.
stuff. But
Hmm.
it's coming at it from them, not, hey, you're part of this group,
Right.
and then therefore are this. I
Hmm.
think that misses more than it makes.
Yeah, I agree, and I don't know how you guys do it, but I have a some flexibility, and I've told you know uh, admin folks at my job, I say, listen, I just want broad brushstrokes. I don't. Some therapists really like the full download before
Mhm.
they do the first session, and that's cool. That's a way of doing it. And I'm like, I don't want to go in blind, but if
Mhm.
someone's been sexually abused, okay, I should probably have a heads up for that. Or if someone's been has a TBI, a traumatic brain
Yes.
injury, that okay, I should probably know that. So, but I give a very loose skeleton. I don't actually want to know all the details. I want the client to tell me that, but I want to know, big stuff, obviously. But and sometimes clients will ask me that. They're like, "Oh, you've read my file." I said, "No, no, no. I got the Reader's Digest version. I want to hear you tell me." Oh, okay, okay, okay. And then they tell me, and I mean, that's what I would want. I wouldn't want to meet somebody or hang out with a friend, and I read all this stuff about them and be like, oh, okay, and I already have these ideas. I would want to know maybe some idea, but then like get to know the person. So I think in some ways, with clients as people, you want to do that. You want to try and find who they are as people.
And not reduce them to the checklist or the symptoms or the
Yeah,
what fits on
the
2 pages.
diagnosis or the
Exactly.
category, the label, and I mean
Mhm.
those have utility, but it's not
Yes.
just that. So,
Yeah.
um, okay, so I guess maybe one of the last things here is um do you think this is something I thought about? It's not a secret that I'm fairly centrist,
Mhm.
very pragmatic politically, and in a lot of ways, I guess, and maybe center left on a lot of things, but some days more center.
Mhm.
And I guess the question I would have is, where do you think from the past? Oh my goodness, let's say 5 years with you know Trump and the
Mm.
administration, and I'm thinking back to that
Mm.
campaign in 15, 16, and then the campaign we just had. And do you think, I have ideas about this, I really want to hear your thoughts though, that is our lives too consumed with politics? Are we too, I think it's important, right? But are we too drowned in it? I think,
Mhm.
um, whether it's the farce of politics and then
Mhm.
actual policy, there's not been a lot of meat the past couple of years. But do you think that's too much, or what's your opinion on that?
Yeah. Well, and I can already anticipate where my answer was going and then where the retort would be from some,
Sure.
where I was going to say, yes, I think we are too collectively obsessed. And I think that doesn't mean not caring about important things,
Right.
but we've essentially had a worldwide obsession. It's almost like going from folie à deux to folie à billions over Donald Trump. And I think the way that he has just consumed
Hmm.
the inner working, I'll never forget, I was in New York um, early 2017
Hmm.
visiting family, and I was riding a subway in New York. So this would have been about maybe 2 months after that, what was at the time a very shocking election.
Hmm.
And I remember sitting on the subway car in New York, and just doing what you do in New York, which is observe and
Right.
listen
People
and
watch.
notice what's
Right.
around, people watch.
Right.
And I counted every conversation that I could audibly make out, which was about 15 different conversations.
Hmm.
I would hear Trump, 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 Trump,
Hmm.
Trump, 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 Trump.
Right.
I remember thinking at that point, there's something weird happening here where he has
Hmm.
essentially like hacked the attention span of
Yeah.
people. And you combine that with social media and the way that it's just so addictive in a lot of ways
Hmm.
for people. I think most people could stand to have as much energy invested in other parts of their life, and they're
Yeah.
finding beauty and engaging in relationships and enjoying food and the world and nature and
Hmm.
reading and all the rest of those things, which, you know, on a day-to-day basis for the average person has a bigger influence on them
Hmm.
than what the president might be tweeting. Now,
Right.
I recognize I'm opening myself up to a huge obvious criticism, low-hanging fruit, which is, well, that's a very privileged way to look at the world. And I will admit there's an element to that.
Sure.
I don't
Right.
think it's the only element. I think that on the whole, I do think we are too consumed with the nonsense and
Yeah.
perhaps not consumed enough with the things that matter. And I'll
Yeah.
give you one example to this. And let's go for some third rail topics while we're
Sure.
warming.
Yeah.
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 If you want to do this, if a genie came down and
Hmm.
said you can do one policy change,
Hmm.
one thing that would improve the lives of the average African American person living in the United States. To me, and it's not particularly close, it would be literally putting an end to the war on drugs.
Oh yeah.
That would be
Oh yeah.
by far and away.
Yeah.
The amount of focus that we spend, though, on a policy change like that,
Mm-hmm.
compared to the focus that we spend on all the other things surrounding these issues and all of the,
Mm-hmm.
uh, you know, everything you see online, which we both know what we're referring to.
Mm-hmm.
It's a drop in the bucket.
Mm-hmm.
So I
Mm-hmm.
think if people were more civically engaged in a sense, in a real policy sense, and
Mm-hmm.
said, here's a change that would improve lives. If I say that Black Lives Matter, as they do,
Mm-hmm.
what does that mean? And what would really help us get there?
Right.
It would be devoting all my time and energy towards that,
Right.
not finding ambiguous circumstances on a cell phone and saying, well, this proves this.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think the world is usually a little bit messier than that. I don't think these things are quite as cut and dry as they sometimes are made to be. So yeah, long way of saying I think we are overly obsessed and yet maybe not obsessed with the right things enough.
I yeah, it's a beautiful way of framing it. I wholeheartedly agree. Where I think I think if you take let's say if you take the kind of very lefty liberal, bleeding hearts, one equality and inclusion and all the rest and work for minorities and disenfranchised groups and all the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. That's wonderful. And I have a strong sense of that as well. And I just feel like it's big on liberals. It's just kind of like kids in a candy shop. It's like, oh, this one, oh, this one, oh, this one. And it's like, wait. Let's just focus on the core essential things. And maybe we can get some of that stuff. Like
Mm-hmm.
kind of what you're saying, war on drugs, certain types of, wealth and income inequality, certain types of things in the judicial system, on and on
Yeah.
and on, kind of tangible things that impact people's basic livelihood. And I feel like there's a handful of people that want to do that or they have that motivation and then they just kind of get, it's just like terrible ADHD. And it's like, well, this and this and this and this and this. And,
Or
a lot of that
I
feels
think
like a red herring.
sometimes I think there's really good intentioned people that just don't know their way. I think
Mm-hmm.
sometimes, to be honest, what I sense is that some people are, and these are generalizations, but I think they're out there, is they're less concerned about solving those problems. A, because solving those problems sort of takes away their raison d'etre
Mm-hmm.
in life, and B, it's less about solving the issues and more about showing the people around you that you're on the right side of things and not
Right.
solving them altogether. But I'm very with you. I find that often I'm in agreement in terms of the aims that's
Mm-hmm.
often being promoted. Not
Mm-hmm.
always. I think there's sometimes
Yeah.
where that but most of the time I would say I'm actually I'm a center left person generally, and some issues even more so. But temperamentally, I feel out of step with a lot of this because I
Mm-hmm.
think it misunderstands a few things. It misunderstands how change happens, right?
Yeah.
And it also misunderstands how much change has occurred and
Mm-hmm.
why.
Right.
I think if we look at where we've come from over the past several hundred years as a human species, how far we've come in the last 60 here in the United States, how far we've
Right.
come in the last 10,
Right.
you name it, a lot of things have gone in the right direction. And I think rather than throw it all out, we're better off asking, well, why did that happen? And what can we learn and what can we draw from when it comes to that?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think I find myself often skeptical of the proposed methods, even
Mm-hmm.
if I'm in favor of the outcome. And defunding, as Obama came out and talked about today, is a
Yeah.
perfect example of this. Of
Right.
like, who wouldn't
Right.
genuinely, who would not want to see fewer people of any race really killed by police? Who would not want to see a more sensible system which doesn't put police in
Mm-hmm.
situations that they shouldn't be doing?
Mm-hmm.
And then I ask, well, who would think that the best way to get there is to come up with a slogan that's going to immediately turn off
Right.
50% of people or
Yeah.
more?
I mean,
Uh,
and I can if I'm charitable in that I can understand the folks getting animated about that and
yeah.
wanting to enough's enough, and
Mhm.
feeling really impassioned by that. I
Mhm.
can feel some of that emotion, or I can be, empathic to some of that. But then I think the element of that is, you know, again, I had one of my other guests on the podcast. We talked about um, how real progressivism is pragmatic. Like
Mhm.
that's how it works. You
Yeah.
use institutions. Like this isn't we're not this isn't a compound somewhere, and we're just Lord of the Flies and all. We're doing things in a way of we use institutions, but that just means that it's going to go at a glacial pace,
Mhm.
and you're just going to make a lot of compromises. You're not going to get everything you want. But
Yep.
this I've been saying this is that's the kind of the in some ways the downside of diversity. When you have so many different people from so many different walks of life and so many experiences and so many places, you're in a democracy, you're going to have people that have a bunch of different ideas and a bunch of different ways of thinking about things, and it just takes longer to
It's a beautiful thing though
explore that.
about it. I
It's
mean,
no, it's
and
beautiful.
and
I
I think we should cherish that. I mean, we should
absolutely.
to that point look at this as like what an incredible experiment and what a great thing that
Hmm.
we for the like in some ways the miracle is that for tens of thousands of years we were so tribal and would hate anyone that didn't look like us that
Yeah,
we would
it's
even be
too
doing what we're doing.
homogenized, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And so how wonderful. And as part of that, you have this beautiful liberal democracy
Hmm.
that you win sometimes and you lose sometimes and you get to fight it again 2 years later and 4 years later and 6 years later. And over time, as people spend more time with each other and as we sort of prejudices go down. I mean, that's the thing. If you look at any objective measure of views about Jewish people, views about African Americans, views about
Right,
interracial marriage, like we are moving in that right direction.
right.
I get it. Sometimes the pace, and I recognize, it's, I think sometimes the privilege talk can be overstated. I think sometimes it's really good to recognize that. And I recognize that for
Right.
me, being able to kind of take a dispassionate view of things is a
Mhm.
sign of some privilege, right? Of like,
Mhm.
it's not somebody from my neighborhood that I, knew that went through this.
Right.
And that said, I think sometimes you need to take a dispassionate view if you're really interested in what's going to create change, what's going to really move us in the
Yeah.
direction that, and I think not assuming that anyone who doesn't agree on every method
Mhm.
is suddenly your enemy. And I think some, recognize that people of totally good faith
Mhm.
can vote either for Proposition, I think it was 16, I always forget in California about the affirmative
That
action,
sounds right.
or against it.
Right.
And both of those people could actually really care deeply about the welfare of minorities.
Right. Absolutely.
But I think we sometimes lose that nuance to it.
No, 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 I completely agree, and I think that that's my. I felt this way for a long time, but it's my aim is I just I want to have conversations and interactions with all
Mhm.
types of people, and engage with people on that, and see where everyone can learn from each other, and
Mhm.
find my main thesis, because I'm such a humanist, is we're so much more alike than we are
Mm.
dissimilar, and we just have to find that. And I think we want a lot of the same things. We just have wildly different ways of expressing it and showing it. And so I think if we're able to tap into that, we can get a lot. And once we do that, and we have kind of unified front, that's important. But
Mhm.
it's going to
It's
be
interesting.
conversation by conversation.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I haven't come to a new idea for a book, but I had like a grain of sand of an idea, whatever you would call like the
Hmm.
the seed,
Hmm.
which was pretty much exactly what you just said, which is really highlighting using a combination of story, data, everything.
Hmm. Hmm.
That very fact, which is, in some ways, so much comes down to the fact that it's the between group differences that get magnified when
Yeah,
really it's
it's
the
always within group that's bigger.
within groups that's more. I mean, and that very basic scientific fact, I think, goes right over people's heads,
Hmm.
especially when you're talking about between group similarities.
Hmm.
Like it's not the 2% that doesn't overlap that
Hmm.
defines who we are. At
Right.
the end of the day, all these people that we're talking about want most of the same thing. I genuinely think most people, with exceptions, are decent and
Yeah.
want generally the same things in life, right? They want
Hmm.
safety, they want relationships, they want opportunities,
Right.
they want quality, they want freedom, they want to be left the hell alone sometimes, even
Yeah.
so just all kinds
Yeah.
of things.
Yeah.
But I think we would do well to remember that more as we go through these discussions. And I'm with you. I think the way to do it is just have more of these conversations with people that we agree on some things, disagree on others,
Hmm.
and see that that's okay.
Hmm.
Uh,
Yeah. I mean, and I think that's, and it has to be that. And I, because I think it always has been that way in some ways, it's always been fine. And I think that we have to, I think, just rediscover the humanity of people that's just there and in front of us. And I think that's, that's most important. And I think in some ways, people are always more important than ideas.
mhm,
Ideas are super important. I love that stuff, but
mhm.
the person is important to me though. And that's, and I think that's where, using the connections through relationships will help us, get to, more pluralistic and better ideas. So I think that's the lane. So
You're doing a huge part in that. I know we're running a little late, but you are, by the way.
I'll
It's
do my little
9:30.
bit. I'll do my little bit in this corner of the universe. You'll see.
No, I'm already impressed, and I think you're having really interesting, different kinds of thinkers coming on, and people that are in their own corners of the world. I mean, that's all we're doing is our own corner of the world. But
Hmm.
if you're bringing enough of those corners together
Yeah.
and sharing that and getting these ideas out, and that's really what it's about. So,
Yeah. No, I listen, I can't thank you enough for giving me more than 2 hours of your time. I feel super grateful about that and talking about, stuff that, you're super sharp on and so many other things. And some people have wanted me to fight more with my guests and I'm like, no, I don't want to fight with anybody. But they
well,
don't
you're
want me to be,
modeling what we all need to do, which is the
yeah,
ability to engage
they
and
don't
show.
want me to be too agreeable. And I said, don't worry. I have plenty of people down the pipeline that I'll fight with at some point. We'll have spirited debates. But listen, this was wonderful. I greatly appreciate you being so generous with your time. Um,
Oh, it's been a
you
lot of
have an
fun.
open door, open invitation anytime you want to
All
get
right.
on here and try some ideas out. You just
I'll
let me
take
know.
you up on that at some point for sure. Because
Yeah.
yeah, it's fun. And to your point earlier, we spend all our days kind of in our own doing our thing,
Right.
and it
Right.
is great to not only have a normal conversation with. I don't mean it that way that came out. It's been two
No,
hours
I
in, so
know.
please forgive me.
I know
But
what you mean.
to talk about awe just
Hmm.
casually in this
Hmm.
way like we did today, but to also then talk about these other issues facing the world and our country, and
Yeah.
how do
Yeah.
we as psychologists and as people that care about people
Yeah.
uh, come up with ways to do our small little part in doing that. And I think these are fascinating ideas. So
Yeah.
I'd love to come on another time for sure.
Yeah, it's an open door for sure. Well, thanks, Jonah. I appreciate all your time and for catching up with you and sharing so many good things.
Thanks for having me.
All right, man.